It's that time on Saturday night when we take a deeper look. Tonight, the global agreement on climate change is final after 2 weeks of negotiations in Paris. World leaders representing 195 countries have agreed that they'll work to limit global warming. The deal includes a commitment to cutting greenhouse gas emissions. President Obama called the deal historic today, while noting that it's not perfect.
Even if all the initial targets set in Paris are met, we'll only be part of the way there when it comes to reducing carbon from the atmosphere. So we cannot be complacent because of today's agreement. The problem's not solved because of this accord. But make no mistake, the Paris Agreement establishes the enduring framework the world needs to solve the climate crisis.
Some of the highlights of this historic deal include limiting greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible, keep global temperatures increase well below 3.6 Fahrenheit, and developing countries will receive $100 billion a year in climate finance. China is recognized as one of the biggest polluters in the world, responsible for about 14% of greenhouse gas emissions. Al Jazeera's Adrian Brown joins us now from Beijing with more on the country's reaction to the new climate deal. Adrian, how will China be impacted by this agreement?
Well, of course, the world is now watching China and watching China very closely, because for this agreement in Paris to work, China is going to have to make some pretty painful decisions. This is a country that is addicted to fossil fuels. It's highly dependent on coal. The coal industry, the steel industry are huge employers. And China is going to have to begin the delicate task of slowly closing down some of those big mills and big plants. Just a few days ago, I was in Sichuan province in southwest China, reporting from a steel town where the plant was closed 9 months ago with the loss of some 16,000 jobs. The reason? It was a heavy polluter. So is this now going to be the template for the rest of the country? And of course, what China can't afford to happen is to have thousands, perhaps millions of unemployed workers, because that would create what the regime here feels most, which is social instability. So for China, it really is walking a tightrope at the moment. This is what China is committed to, though. It has said that by 2030, it will ensure that all its greenhouse gas emissions will peak. That's 15 years from now. Also, 15 years from now, China says it hopes that 20% of all of its energy needs will come from renewables. I've been to the west of the country just a few months ago in Xinjiang province, and in one area we saw wind farms just as far as the eye could see, wind turbines. It was an amazing sight. So China is beginning to invest heavily in renewables, some $100 billion, a staggering sum. So yes, all eyes on China. China knows that it has to act. Its people are very, very anxious for something to happen. For the past few days, Beijing, although it's clear today, has been experiencing some of the worst air pollution in the last 3 years. The air quality index yesterday, for instance, was 356, which is hazardous. And days like that have become the norm rather than the exception. But sadly, if I was to drive outside of Beijing now and talk to people about what was happening in Paris, they wouldn't know what I was talking about. Sadly, there's almost a sort of fatalistic acceptance here about the environment. They know their country is polluted, and they know that nothing's going to change for many years.
All right, thank you. And joining us now is David Kanter, who is an assistant professor of environmental studies at the New York University, and Mark Magnia. He is president and CEO of Green Latinos, a national coalition of Latino environmental natural resources and conservation leaders. Thank you so much for joining us. David, I'll start with you. Now that a deal has been reached, the future of this agreement now will be eventually decided by different countries. Do you think that there will be any pushback?
So maybe, but the important thing to see from today is that there really was a positive atmosphere in that chamber when the agreement was passed, and the countries that are traditionally known as the ones to kind of be the fly in the ointment, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Ecuador, all endorsed the deal. So there really was a sense of achievement today, and that something historic had been done. Another thing to note is that countries, 186 of them, have already come to the table with the contributions that they're going to make to help deal with climate change, ones that they feel are politically feasible at a domestic level. And so in that sense, they've already agreed to what they are going to be doing at home, which limits the amount of pushback you might see.
And just to put the shoe on the other foot, it essentially took 2 decades to get to this point. If this doesn't go through, is there a plan B?
No, but I think that this is the plan B. What was plan A was in Copenhagen back in 2009 when they were trying to get a global agreement with a global target. And they really learned the lessons from that this time in that they got each country to come to the table with their own targets. And in that way, they avoided some of perhaps the dangers of political failure and chaos that really came through in Copenhagen 6 years ago.
And I'm going to turn things over now to Mark. Mark, you actually attended the conference in Paris. What are your expectations from today's announcement?
Thanks, BC, and it's great to be with you this evening. My expectations are high from this historic announcement. It was historic in what it did do and historic in what it didn't achieve. It achieved legally binding emission reductions while only taking us to a 3-degree limit, while we need to get this country and the world down to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees to make it manageable. It's historical in that we are able to see that we can support the more vulnerable countries, like countries in Latin America, where my members are very concerned about, and be able to support the work they're going to do to be able to create a renewable energy future.
And are there concerns at all about job losses or job gains?
There are some concerns out there about job losses, but from polling we've done, most Latinos domestically believe that there will be more job increases the more you invest in renewable energy. And in Latin America, they take this very seriously. 4 of the top 10 investors in renewable energy are Mexico, Brazil, Uruguay, and Chile. And they've seen dramatic job increases in that area. So what they've seen has been very successful, and the naysayers who've been trying to scare us into thinking that these are job killers, that the work that we're doing they're falling on deaf ears in our communities.
Very interesting. And David, if no action is taken to lower greenhouse emissions, what are the consequences? We're talking about the rising sea level, droughts, flooding. Just how bad could it get?
It could get very bad if we don't do something, but and it's been, we already see a lot of those impacts. For example, the drought in California. We've been seeing flooding in India. We've been seeing the highest levels of smog in Beijing during the talks. So it's clear that the impacts, if we don't do anything, will be drastic, but we're already feeling them now. But I do really believe that this agreement sets us on the right track. It doesn't solve climate change, but it really provides a framework for us to increase ambition over time to have a best chance possible to meet the ambitious 2-degree target and even a 1.5-degree target that has been outlined in the agreement.
So you're basically saying that some progress is better than none at all?
Yes, and I think, given this is an incredibly tricky thing to do, to get 195 countries together in a room and agree on anything, particularly something that completely transforms the global economy. 85% of our energy comes from fossil fuels, and essentially we need to then get 90% of our energy from renewables by 2050 if we want to be anywhere close to getting to a 2-degree target. So it is a huge global transformation that we're asking for, and we need to do it with everyone on board. So the fact that we even got a clear, transparent framework, an ambitious one at that, is really historic and something to celebrate.
And you speak on this being a global transformation, and I imagine that this is something that's going to affect you, it's going to affect myself, my kids, in the future. What are we looking at here?
A lot of the transformation has to come from where we get our energy. So, as I said, most of our energy now comes from fossil fuels, and that's very carbon intensive. It's what leads to the greenhouse gas emissions that go into the atmosphere and warm the climate. And so a lot of the transition needs to come from getting away from fossil fuels into cleaner energies. That being said, there are other sectors we also have to look at, which the U.S. has been acting on. For example, making our cars more efficient, making them more fuel efficient. We also need to look at ways to produce more food in a less polluting way, and make sure that we preserve the world's forests, because they are very important in taking up a lot of the carbon that we emit to the atmosphere. So all these elements are critical, and those kind of transformations are the fundamental ones that need to occur.
And I'm sure we're going to be hearing more and more about these different ideas as the years come.
Yes.
And the road to a climate agreement has not been a smooth one. Negotiators debated several sticking points throughout the two-week summit as they drafted the deal. For more on the biggest points of contention, let's watch this report from Al Jazeera's Jacob Ward.
This summit in Paris has been arguably one of those complicated negotiations in human history. Imagine trying to get together with 189 other nations to agree how it is we're all going to live together on this planet, and trying to actually write that down in a single document. That document has been slowly shrinking over time as the sort of conditional language has been cut out of it and more concrete commitments are inserted, down from roughly 100 pages to around 50 pages, down to 27 pages. But even once we have gotten to the final document here, a few sticking points are going to remain. The first is, how is it that we're going to pay for the adaptations that various nations need to make when it comes to climate change? Who's going to finance India's solar program? Who's going to help Brazil move off of its coal and natural gas? Beyond that, there's the question of differentiated responsibilities. The top 10 emitters in the world account for over 70% of the greenhouse gases. And so you have the United States, you have Brazil, you have India, you have China in that list, and yet all of those countries would argue that they have very different capabilities and different responsibilities. So how do you make everyone an equal partner while also recognizing the unique challenges of each nation? And finally, how much can we actually hold emissions to limit the amount of climate change, the amount of global warming? A high ambition coalition emerged around the center of this summit, led in part by the United States, the European Union, Mexico, which commits to a 1.5 degrees Celsius or less limit. The other nations are talking more about a 2 or 2.5 degree limit. And so actually committing to a global limit of warming, that, after all, is the final goal here. And that's going to continue. That hard work is going to continue long past the end of this summit.
And Jake Ward touched on the issue of funding. It will take billions upon billions of dollars to put something like this through. When you talk about poorer countries, say India and China, where they have such a dependence on fossil fuels, how will they receive the help that they need?
Well, China, it's important to know that they are already a leader in renewables. They're the top producer of wind energy. They're the top producer of solar panels. And they're doing this not just because they know that if they don't, the environmental impacts will be huge. They also see a huge market opportunity. So they're trying to deal with this on both ends. And when it comes to India, there's a real tension there, because they also have a huge proportion of their population that is still in poverty, and that they want to bring them out of poverty, and that often includes access to energy. There are millions, hundreds of millions of the Indian population that still don't have access to energy. And what we want to make sure, if we want to be able to deal with this climate problem, is that the energy that they do get is clean and not fossil fuel. And then in terms of the billions of other dollars, that's also to some of the poorest countries in the world, in sub-Saharan Africa and other low-lying states. And that will not only help them to reduce their emissions, but also to adapt to the impacts of climate change that unfortunately are already here. So this agreement is really about limiting the worst case scenario towards the end of this century.
And Mark, I'll turn things over to you. This agreement calls for halting warming at no more than 2 degrees Celsius, with the hopes of reaching a limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Some scientists say these are ambitious goals. Mark, what do you think it will take to reach them?
I think they are ambitious goals, but we need to be this ambitious if we want to save this planet for our future generations. It's going to take what we've seen in Paris today. It's going to take 190 nations, incredibly, coming together and saying, this is the issue of our time. This is our moonshot. We need to come together and fight this. We need to fight this with 100% renewable energy. We need to fight this by becoming more friendly with our land and with our environment. In the Latino community, we are we're considered cultural conservationists. where it's not just the fuel we burn or whether or not we use renewable energy. It's how we treat our land. It's how we treat our water with respect. It's the ability to recycle, reuse, repurpose what we have to be able to not be so dependent on purchasing new items over and over again and filling landfills. It's a matter of respect that we see from indigenous communities, and some of these communities are suffering the most from the effects of climate change and the effects of clear cutting, and we need to make sure that we protect these. And so all of this is what we need to do to make sure that we are preserving this world of ours for our future generations.
And Mark again touched on the word that we've been hearing a lot of today, ambitious. There's something called an ambitious, high ambition coalition. Do you believe that that's achievable?
Well, so that coalition was really something that came out of the last 2 weeks. It's a group of over 100 countries that was led by some of the small island states, notably the Marshall Islands, and the EU, and then the US joined, and Brazil joined. And so it was quite an eclectic group of countries that were really calling for more ambitious targets within the deal, and were a key reason why the final deal has surpassed many people's expectations. They called for the inclusion of this 1.5 degrees Celsius target, which not many were expecting. And they were also calling for, and this is also important, for countries to meet every 5 years to be able to ratchet up the ambition of their targets, because right now there is a disconnect between having these global targets, but then if you add up all the country contributions, it's nowhere close to what the global target needs to be. And so by being able to meet every 5 years, they can ratchet up their ambition and make sure and tighten the targets, which hopefully will also be possible given the signal that this deal sends to the global marketplace and unleashes hopefully innovation and lowers the costs of technologies that will really help us solve this crisis.
So again, a lot of optimism today out of Paris, and it sounds like that you're sharing some of that hope.
Yeah, you know, and I think a lot of credit also needs to go to the French. They really put a lot of political capital on the line, and they learned the lessons from Copenhagen. You know, one of the things that really, there were many things, reasons for why Copenhagen was chaotic, but one was that the final deal was negotiated in a room of about 20 people at 3 a.m. on a Friday and then presented to the plenary, and no one knew what had happened. Here, the French made sure that it was a much more inclusive and transparent process and really engaged in shuttle diplomacy to make sure everyone's voice was heard, so when the final agreement came out, there were no surprises and everyone felt that their issue had been heard and was fairly represented in the final deal.
All right. Thank you so much, David Kanter. Really appreciate your expertise, as well as yourself, Mark Magenia. Thank you again for joining us this evening.